Good evening, everyone. My name is Rahul Verma. I work here at the Center for Policy Research. Uh, Thank you, everyone, for joining us today here in the room, and those of you who have joined us on Zoom. This is the 10th edition of How India Votes series. As always, I had overpromised that I'll do a series of conversation in the run-up to 2024 election. And the idea is that by March, April, we'll have 24 such conversations, largely to figure out how Indians vote. And so each of these conversations in last 2, 3 months have been basically focusing on one single question and then trying to dive deep into it. And hopefully this becomes one of like the resources on internet where students who are interested in Indian elections and politics can watch some of these conversations, since the young generation is less likely to be interested in reading and consuming information through podcast and videos. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm joined by two esteemed colleagues and seniors in the field. Professor Vivek Yadav, he teaches political science at Ashoka University. His work largely focuses on modern Indian politics, but from a democratic theory perspective. And his work actually revolves around some of the questions that we are going to discuss today. Long back, I had heard that he's writing a paper on election Hawa. So I just returned from Madhya Pradesh on 17th, like the second round of polling. And I met him and it said, like everyone is, Madhya Pradesh is saying that there is fatigue. And fatigue is not a political science term in that sense to explain voting behavior. So how do we use some of the things that we hear on the ground and try to understand how voters think about Indian elections? Because I think there is a disjunction between the language that political analysts, or especially people who write research papers and books, the language and concepts they use, and the language and concepts that voters use on the ground. There is a disjunction between the two. And can we sort of like think together and work out a framework? My second panelist today is Vandita Mishra. She has a vast experience of political reporting, more than 2 decades of political reporting on the ground. And she's one of the people, when she writes like her election coverage, I really like to read in a lot of detail, because look, nuances, not just nuances about what voters are thinking, but also those colorful idioms which voters use and express becomes one sort of like signal to understand what might be happening on the ground. So Vivek and Vandita ji, thank you for joining us today. I'm likely to be nervous, as in the audience is Yogendra Yadav. 15 years ago, like I remember it was Karnataka elections when I first sat in his room to discuss Karnataka election as intern at Lokniti CSDS. So 15 years of whatever I have learned election about Indian elections will remain a footnote to Yogenji's knowledge about Indian politics and voting behavior. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. So let me sort of like dive into the conversation right away, and I'll request my panelists to be brief so that we can have multiple rounds of conversation. My first question to Vivek, and some of those largely draw up from our previous conversations, which is about, do we actually have a framework about using the language and concepts that voters use? And I'll give you some examples, right? Because the word, why I was intrigued by the word fatigue is, when does fatigue actually happens? Is it 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Because in a dominant party state, like, you had CPM in West Bengal or Gujarat, BJP in Gujarat, these parties have been in power for 25, 30 odd years. And while we think of these words in a normal election context, they don't make sense for a dominant party state, because dominant party state elections are going to be different. So for me, the question in Madhya Pradesh is whether it has become a BJP state, a dominant party state or not. Similarly, and you also, during our conversation, which is, voters often talk about इस बार बदलाव चाहिए, परिवर्तन होना चाहिए. But when you start probing them, it seems that most voters will stay with how they had voted in the past. And so they use the word parivartan is much more sort of like in an abstract sense, or there is some meaning attached to it. And especially they use janta parivartan chahti hai. And so who is this Janta? Is it caste community? Is it your own sort of like sense of community in the rural areas or in urban sense? So can you use some of these concepts and words to tell us about why there is this disjunction? And can we start thinking about like a framework to understand Indian politics from voters' perspective?
Thank you, Rahul, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation and of this wonderful series that reflects on how India votes. I must say it's a great honor to be here at the Center for Policy Research, which has been such a fantastic center for scholarship on Indian society and politics over the years, and which, against all odds, continues to remain a center of excellence in its 50th year. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm also thrilled to be in conversation with a distinguished journalist and commentator like Vandita. Most of what I've learned about Indian politics has been neither from books of political science, nor from political scientists themselves, but from journalists without whose work no political analysis or theory would be possible. The work of political theory is almost completely parasitic on the work of journalists. And the importance of good journalism for a healthy democracy can be seen from the fact that part of the present crisis of our democracy is rooted in a crisis of Indian journalism. So very glad and honored to share the same space as you, Vandita. Let me use my opening remarks for making a case very briefly for taking seriously the language of political discourse in India, because I think that's very much the sort of the point that you were trying to get at. And let me make my case by arguing against what a political scientist friend of mine said in a seminar like this, which was held, if I remember correctly, in the aftermath of the 2019 general elections. What bothered this friend of mine was the fact that everyone around him, journalists, political commentators, pundits, etc., were asking whether the recently concluded elections were a wave election or whether the silent voter had been a factor. Voicing his exasperation, this friend of mine said, and I quote, "I've never understood these terms, wave and silent voter. We political scientists don't understand these terms, Hawa, Pani, Leher, etc. All these terms are not used in political science because they don't mean anything." He went on to say that the meaninglessness of these terms was confirmed upon looking through the index of what he regarded as the Bible of all those who study Indian elections, or study elections in general, the American voter, and finding that these terms were not mentioned there. Now, I've kept this person unnamed because these words capture the thinking not only of that particular individual, but more generally of the practitioners of an entire academic discipline, which also happens to be my discipline, political science, even though I firmly believe that that term is a misnomer. Anyway, so it's not any particular individual then, but a way of thinking characteristic of Indian political scientists that I wish to problematize. Unlike my political scientist friend, I am of the firm belief that political analysis, even theoretical analysis, cannot afford to simply disregard the language of political discourse. Instead, the language of practice must constitute the starting point for theoretical reflection. Now, what is political theory after all? But practical understanding of political actors distilled and subjected to reflection. So why is it necessary for political analysis and theory to take seriously the understanding of political actors themselves? Why can't it simply disregard them? I think the short answer to that question is that politics, unlike the weather, is not a natural phenomenon made up of inanimate entities. Political actors' own understanding of politics is very much constitutive of politics. And we can't proceed in the task of analysis by simply going behind the backs of political actors, but their own understanding, inexact and vague as it might be, right? And it is vague and inexact. And the concepts that are generally in use are practical concepts. They are polysemous, which is to say they have multiple meanings, and they are flexible, right? But this is not a fault, I think. For any concept to be in widespread practical use, it has to be flexible, it has to be inexact. And the task of political theory is to actually begin from such inexact concepts and to distill them and to define them more precisely, right? Not to disregard them. And if you think that I'm proposing something radical or revolutionary, let me remind you that this is precisely what political theory in the West has done for centuries. Take, for instance, the concept of political representation, which is, of course, a widespread concept. It's widely used, right? But it has been subjected to theoretical reflection for almost 400 years, right? Starting with the work of someone called Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan 400 years ago, but the concept still continues to be revised by contemporary democratic theorists, right? So that's very much the task of theory as I understand it. To begin with the practical understanding and the practical concepts of political actors themselves, and then subject them to a kind of reflection and distill them until they become sharpened lenses, which can be used for the purposes of political analysis. So that's the point. That's the first point that I wish to make. And I cannot emphasize this enough, that political analysis and theorizing cannot proceed by ignoring or disregarding the practical understandings of political actors themselves. Right. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that there ought not to be a divergence or a divorce between the language of political practice on the one hand and the language of political analysis. We do find a divergence like this in Indian political science. And the reasons for that are easy to understand, which is that the theory and the body of thinking on politics from which Indian political scientists draw is largely a theory which has developed in order to make sense of the historical developments, political developments in North America and Western Europe. Right? So it is no wonder that that theory and that body of knowledge operates in that language. Right? So the case cannot be that we should not read that body of knowledge or theory. We should read it, certainly, we should learn from it, but we should not expect it to illuminate our world in a straightforward way, right? We should learn from it, but the conceptual labor of theorizing with the concepts of the political vernacular in India is a labor that we have to undertake, right? So we can't take our concepts from textbooks, right? We have to take our concepts from political practice and then subject them to reflection and distillation. So that was the first point that I wanted to make in my opening remarks. I will be happy to talk about the framework, about Hawa, etc., in subsequent remarks. That's okay.
Thank you, Vivek. I'll come back to you on some of the points you raised, but let me turn to Vanditaji. And the question I have for you is twofold. One, like my travels during elections are very limited. And somehow, at least in my head, I try to avoid interpreting too much from colorful idioms because people who tend to talk to strangers and travelers like me are basically generally very talkative people. And they have a certain sort of like socioeconomic background. And so if I try to make sense of what's happening in elections from that set, then I'm missing out a larger pool of people who tend not to talk, but matter much more for election. Second, what and I may be wrong since I have a limited experience in this sense, which is that since you've covered elections for over 2 decades, what now I see or sense happening, especially post 2019 with penetration of social media and even electronic media, the diversity in views which you used to listen on the ground seems to have converged. So everyone seems to be speaking a very similar kind of language or using very similar kind of vocabulary. Drawing on your own experience, how you have seen these things changing, and also if you have like any comments to add on to what Vivek was saying about this disjunction between what people like us do and what you might be hearing on the ground.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always wonderful to come to CPR. And I would rather that I come here just to listen and to learn rather than to speak. But now that I'm in the spot. So, yeah, I've been covering elections for quite some time now, yeah, over 2 decades. And in the last year, I have covered 3 state elections. Last November, I had gone to cover the Gujarat election. After that, in May, there was Karnataka. And now just a few weeks ago, I have gone to Madhya Pradesh. I mean, just responding to something that you said, that when you go to the voter, are you sure that you are listening to the representative voter? Are you sure that you're getting the voice that counts or matters, or that is speaking for that election in some way, rather than just, because you listen to so many things. So I think that the thing there is to go there with a checklist, a sort of a checklist in your mind, and to know that when you're talking to somebody who is perhaps from a particular caste or a class, or in a rural setting or an urban setting, or a woman or a young person, you keep ticking off those boxes in your head till you know that you have spoken to a certain kind of a diverse swathe of voters. And I give myself each time on an election trip at least 2 to 3 days to just listen before I start trying to put these things together in any kind of thread. So I think that is the task of the journalist or the reporter who goes to the ground, to make sure that you listen to a large number of people in a large number of settings, and also that you also pay attention, and you are not there asking a question, you are there listening to what they are saying in response. And there's a very vital difference between the two. So, I mean, typically my checklist will also include a very broad questionnaire where I know that I am asking specific questions. But then there will also be always open-ended questions, which allow the conversation to go in the way that the voter wants to take it. And I mean, the conversations are always long. The conversations are a mix of specific and open-ended questions. So at the end of it, there is a certain, sense that you get that you are onto a pattern or not. And that is a judgment call. There is no formula to it. There is no arithmetic to it. I don't do a scientific survey, and I'm not an academic, so the burden of theorizing is not on me. But I can actually stand outside of the theory and poke it with a few questions. I have a problem with this concept of Hawa. So, I mean, the concept of Hawa itself seems to say that there is something outside of the voters' decisions, and there is something that also has the power to sway it. I think that there is a limited way in which that may be true. I was in fact talking to Sir earlier, and there were elections, yes, in, you could say 1977, you could say the Aam Aadmi Party election of the first time that it swept Delhi. And I will also add to that actually the election in which it swept in Punjab, because I have covered the two, the not 77, but the Delhi one and then the Punjab one. So yes, there are times when voter choices and decisions converge in a way that may give an impression of a Hawa, but even that actually mostly is evident and visible in retrospect, not so much. But when I look back, it is also visible. I mean, there are tangible things. There is a way in which, for instance, I will say that the kind of election that I saw, which the Aam Aadmi Party won in Punjab the last time, was very different from the 3 elections that I described who I went for in the last 1 year. So there are times, I guess, where when voter choices and decisions come together and converge and give an impression of a Hawa. But I think the problem that I have with the concept of Hawa is that too many times we define it as something that is outside of these voters' decisions. So even that, to some extent, cannot be ruled out because we do live in a social media age. You have WhatsApp. There are elections that are called now WhatsApp elections. Now we are being told this one is a YouTube election. So there is such a lot of description and also mythicization of the party machine and the propaganda machinery. To me, when I go to the ground and I ask and I get into a conversation with the voter, and if the voter says, I will not tell you who I'm voting for because I will go by the Hawa. This is a word that voters use many times. For me, that is the cue and the invitation for me to start digging deeper. And inevitably, if I ask enough questions, and if I give it enough time, I will hit the reason that the voter is going to vote a particular way. Now, to get to that reason, again, there is a checklist in my head, whenever I go to the ground, whenever I start a conversation, I start with a small introduction. I tell them who I am, and I say, I'm a journalist from Delhi. I do not have anything to do with the government of the day. I do not have anything to do with any party. I am here as an independent journalist from Delhi. And I think it works most of the time. The distance from Delhi sort of works in my favor. And also, it's important to let them know that you are not from, either a party or a government. And then I think there are things that you have to take into. You cannot simply ask anybody who they are voting for. So the way around it is, for instance, in Madhya Pradesh, when you just went to, I would say typically, I would not use Congress and BJP in my first few questions. So I would say, आपको लगता है कि बदलाव होना चाहिए या फिर जैसा चल रहा है वो ठीक. So जैसा चल रहा है वो ठीक is a euphemism for BJP. बदलाव होना चाहिए is a euphemism for Congress. But I will not use the words Congress and BJP because I don't want the voter to, the flag to go up. And then you come to issues. You say, मुद्दे क्या हैं आपके लिए? आप जहाँ रहते हैं, आपकी neighborhood में मुद्दे क्या हैं? आपके शहर में मुद्दे क्या हैं? आपको लगता है पूरे प्रदेश के मुद्दे क्या हैं? So you start with issues, you start with the need for a change or not, and then you come to parties, and you will get reasons. So in this election, if I can come to that, in Madhya Pradesh, to me, I mean, without getting into an election prediction, I would say that there is no Hawa, but there are enough voices I heard, especially among the young, who said that the BJP, because the BJP has been the incumbent for 20 years with just a small interruption. The Congress had a 15-month government which fell, which the BJP made sure fell. But so for 20 years, the BJP, there is a generation that has grown up and seen only the BJP in government. And there is a generation that has seen only the BJP do Vikas, which is the word for development, and also the scheme. The scheme is the subsidy, the cash transfer of the subsidy. So you have done the Vikas, you've given us Bijli Sadak Pani, you have also given us the scheme, you have put money in my pocket. After that, what? I found a lot of voters asking that question, especially because I make also, it's part of my checklist. I go to colleges in every district that I go. I try and have a conversation in a college because that's where you find the first-time voter, the young voter. And I found again and again voices coming back to me about asking, I've got the scheme, I've got the money, but I need opportunity. I need the opportunity to be free of the handout. I need a job. I need to think of my child's future. I've got the Ladli Behna scheme. I've got money coming to me every month. But what about my child's future? Because he's going to have to go out of the village or the city because there is no good college here. And there is certainly no job. So another factor that, if it could add up to a Hawa in the sense, is that of these examinations, recruitment and admission examinations. There is a series of scams in Madhya Pradesh, which has accumulated from the time of Vyapam to the latest one, which is a Patwari recruitment scam. And in between, there are many. There is, there are people who have been studying nursing BSc, and there has been no exam for 4 years. There is a variety of admission and recruitment scams that have come together for many voters, to give that impression of being walled in, to give that impression of that there is no sense, there is no opening up of opportunity here in this regime. So that, to me, I think you have to, with humility, go from voter choice to choice, put it together, and go from there. I don't think you can start with a question about a Hawa.
Okay. Thank you, Vanditaji. Just friends on Zoom, if you have questions, just put your questions on Q&A box, and my colleague Prakriti will send it to me. Vivek, let me come back to you, and with admission that I might be one of those friends who may have used I don't consider American Voter as a Bible. It was written in 1960, but it remains one of the formidable sort of like work on understanding voting behavior. And I think in 2019, I may have said somewhere like we were using too many of like terms from geology to understand Indian election, wave, earthquake, tsunami, all those kind of things, right? But see, it's not a pushback, but just something for us to think about is that there are very few people who actually use what you'll call as American method to study elections, which is doing surveys and then trying to distill voters' mood. A large part of Indian political science actually does more sort of like, they will call it as qualitative work or political ethnographic work. So they should have been picking up some of these works to theorize. So I don't know whether the problem is that we are drawing from the Western models to study Indian voting behavior, or the problem lies somewhere else. So that's sort of like first point. Second, I think where I want you to reflect a little more, since you talked about the disjunction between the two, and in our conversations, in fact, you brought many of these terms, and you suggested that it seems that among Indian voters, and this may be a wrong term to use, there is a preoccupation with prediction. Though we sort of like in general conversation, we hate sort of like exit polls and why should we do it and all those kind of things. But all the terms, Hawa or, Badlav is basically, or Janta ka rukh kidhar hai. All, and apologies to like non-Hindi speakers, I only know these terms, but anyone from Southern India and East and West, if you have such terms, do write to us and we'll think about it. But largely, like there's a preoccupation with prediction, meaning that voters are trying to figure out is like who's winning, and they're trying to move to the side of winner, because at least what we know from the survey data, 1/4 of voters make up their mind in last 48 hours, and slightly higher number actually makes up their mind in sort of like during the campaign last 1 week. So, and most of those voters are more likely to vote for the winning candidate. This sort of like preliminary analysis. So is this apart from not like partisan voter, is the large mass of Indian voters just trying to predict who's winning, and they are basically trying to be on the side of the winner, because a large population in India sort of like relies on the state for their well-being. So whoever is getting the state power, it's better to be with them. Is that what seems to be happening?
Okay. Thanks, Rahul. And thanks, Vandita, for the comments. I think I want to make 3-4 points, also partly responding to what Vandita said. First, I think I completely agree with your observation when you say that it's difficult to actually ask the voters themselves directly about their voting preference. This is something that I've also noticed in my own ethnography. I used to go to the ground with the assumption that the preferences and the leanings of the voter would be on their sleeves. They would be on their sleeves. But actually, that's not the case. I think that's one learns very quickly. And I was actually quite amazed by the popularity of the secret ballot. The fact that people are quite reticent in talking about their own choices, but they do talk about, oh, the leanings of the public, or is par janta badlav chahti hai, or is par janta ne bana liya, or something like this. So even though when they're talking about their own choices or their own leanings, they frame it in the idiom of the Janata, which is quite interesting. I also completely agree with you that I think any definition of the Hawa, which makes it independent of the voters' own sort of deliberative process, is problematic.
Just one moment. I mean, I think the sum of what I was trying to say was that the Hawa is an outcome, it is not the agent.
No, absolutely. And I think there is so much unclarity in even defining what we should understand by the Hawa. Right? Is it like a meta phenomena? Is it, what is it? Right? So before I come to the Hawa, I think let me take up what Rahul mentioned. This preoccupation with prediction, which I feel is one of the more interesting features of Indian elections. And this is something which, contemporary democratic theory does not prepare us to understand very well. Because if you read the theoretical literature, it tells you that the voters deliberate, and they deliberate by giving each other reasons for why a certain party and its policy platform is actually better than others. And to some extent, one does find a discourse like this on the ground. People do defend parties on the basis of reasons. So there is certainly a deliberated discourse. But interestingly, alongside this deliberated discourse is another kind of discourse, which Rahul just said, it's a predictive discourse. People are always asking who's going to win. How many seats will such a party, such and such party get? Right? And this is a kind of discourse which I think theory does not quite prepare us to understand. But I think that if you pay attention to what is it that they're asking in asking who will win, who will lose, what they're asking really is which way is the public leaning? Right? So the question about who is going to win, or the question about the direction of the Hawa, which is also something that you hear quite a lot, right? Not only among journalists, not only among political pundits, but I think among the electorate at large, you find this sort of question on everyone's, the tip of their tongues, Hawa ka rukh kya hai? Right? I think that question is another form of the question, which is, which way is the public leaning? Right? So the real question behind the preoccupation with prediction is, why is it that Indian voters, and I don't think really that this is a peculiarity of Indian voters, although this preoccupation with prediction seems to loom larger in Indian elections than otherwise. But I think this need of the Indian voter to know the leanings of the public actually tells us something very interesting about the deliberative process of the voter. How is it that voters actually make up their minds? Right. Now, there's one theory that says that, look, election results are simply an aggregation of preformed voter choices. Right? Voters have already made up their minds, right, on whatever basis, and election results simply represent an aggregate of that. But if you take this preoccupation with prediction seriously, right, and don't simply dismiss it as a kind of a quirk, then it forces you to reckon with the fact that perhaps the perceived leanings of the public enter as an important factor in the voters' own deliberation. So just to say, voters make up their minds, not in the vacuum, but by keeping one eye on the leanings of the public. Right? This is not to say that the leanings of the public are easily perceptible every time. They're not. But that is what I think the structure of the voters' deliberation is, that they make up their minds individually, but while keeping one eye on which way is the public leaning. So, what's interesting about this thing is that, of course, election results are understood as the expression of the will of the public, or the Janata ka Mat. That's what it's called literally. But voters are interested in knowing which way the public is leaning even before the election result is out. Right? Because of the secret ballot, telling exactly which way the public is leaning is not a simple matter. Right? It's a matter of perception. And that is why also the political campaigns of political parties, to a large extent, are actually focused on creating an impression of their own popularity. Right? If you look at what rallies and roadshows do in political campaigns, right, they essentially try to showcase the popular support for that party. So in a sense, political campaigns, or I should say the political contest, the electoral contest, is really a contest of perceptions to a large extent. Shakti Pradarsan, right? And what's also interesting is that in order to divine the leanings of the Janata in the run-up to polling, a plethora of signs have been developed over time. So not only crowds in rallies and roadshows, but also, say, a en masse shift in the political loyalties of small and large, big political leaders. Right? If you see political leaders changing sides in the pre-electoral period, that's often taken to be a sign of the Hawa, right? The direction of the Hawa. So I think that if we take this slightly more sophisticated view of the deliberative process of the voter, then you can define the Hawa in a way that actually, is not independent of the voter's own choices. So let me take a jab at this, and this is a tentative definition. The Hawa, I think, can be defined as a belief that builds up in the period in the run-up to polling, right, about the popularity of a certain contender, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because it enters into the considerations of individual voters. So a Hawa is a belief, is a perception. In the pre-electoral period, of course, it's an unfounded belief. But after that belief is borne out by the election result, and it does not have to be, but if it is, right, the Hawa becomes even more clearly discernible. That's why the Hawa is always clearer in retrospect. But that's what a Hawa is, I think. It's not a phenomenon that is independent of the voters' own deliberations, but rather a phenomena which is rooted in the fact that voters see themselves in voting as acting as agents of the public. So when they vote, they don't vote as individuals acting in a vacuum, but as contributing to the public will. That's why it's important for them to keep an eye out on the leanings of the public. That's why, and I think, and with this I'll stop. I think that this view of Hawa is actually borne out by a commonplace of Indian political discourse, which is this idea of not wasting your vote. Right? This is something that we hear all the time. What does it mean to waste your vote? To waste your vote means to vote for any party that ends up on the losing side. And to not waste your vote means for voting for the winning party. Now, this phenomena, or this idea, is often given a reductive interpretation by saying that actually, it reflects the sort of conformist mentality of the Indian electorate, the bhed chal of Indian voters. Right? But if you keep in mind that voters see themselves as contributing to the construction of a public will, then the idea of not wasting one's vote is to vote with the public. Right? So to vote with the direction of the Hawa is actually, in the minds of many voters that I've talked to rise above partisan caste community considerations. As they say, to vote with the Hawa is not to vote your caste. So I think it can be, the Hawa can be kind of given an interpretation like that.
So, as much as what you said is, one hears that from voters, okay, vote waste nahi karna hai. I don't want to waste my vote. I want to vote in a way that makes a difference to the change of government or the lack of change. As much as one hears that, one also hears other voices, and those other voices are like, I will hear people say, I don't care whether my vote changes the government in the capital. I am going to change, I want change of my local level candidate. I'm happy for there not to be a change in the government, as long as I can get my local MLA or MP out and get another guy in who will listen to me. This guy hasn't come to me in 5 years. So my ambition is limited to that. I have also heard, and I have heard it enough to give credence to it, that it is not a one-off voice. I have heard across the states that I've traveled, people saying, I am not voting to form the government. I am voting to form the opposition.
Yeah.
This is a democracy, and a democracy has to have a strong opposition. So I don't care whether this guy I'm voting for becomes part of government. If he's in the opposition, and a democracy needs a strong opposition. And like I said, I've heard enough voices of this kind to know that these are not erratic voices. So I agree that there is a section that will, that is also considered part of the floating vote, or the fence sitters, who will say, I will make up my mind at the last minute and I will see the Hawa because I will vote with the winner, the winnability criterion. But I often think, and that is based on whatever traveling and listening to voters that I've done, that this is mostly also pandering to the conceit of parties, because parties believe that they can turn the campaign around at the last minute. There will be this one Modi rally and roadshow that will make all the difference. And in fact, the most I've heard of this kind of argument, is in Punjab. It's a state I come from, but it is a hotbed of conspiracy theories. Every election that I've covered, I'm told all the time that, you don't know this election, the way it will turn. Everything will change, you will see, in the last night. So, something will come out and liquor will flow. And but I've learned to completely disregard these voices. I think conspiracy theories and the conceit of parties will feed into these. I really do think that the Hawa may be a factor, but I don't think it is the important factor in voter choices. And I've learned to keep chipping away at voters till you hit the reason. And there is always a reason. Almost always a reason why they will vote here and not there.
Well, Mataji, if I may ask you something, which is, to me, what feels like, and part of the problem I think Vivek was hinting at, but didn't go into deep, is that political analysis in India preoccupies with and especially the election analysis, preoccupies with structure of politics, right? Like structural factors. We focus too much on caste like Bahubali candidates and those kind of things, and elite mechanization. And nowadays, everyone tries to understand who's offering more sort of like last minute welfare schemes and those kind of things. And long back, I'd learned this, that while these things explain the structure of political parties and their social basis, this does not explain change. Right? And elections at the end of the day is about the changes that take place. And so what are because to my mind, and that's why I would say, like, Indian voters, I think in some ways, Vivek, you're trying to paint a much more sort of like, not, the word wouldn't be romantic, but you're bringing excitement into what Indian voters might be doing. To me, like there is a very boring process involved, right? Political parties that have sort of like a wider social base, better organization, leadership, some performance, and you add those 4 or 5 factors. That is what gives edge, rather than sort of like the structural things that we talk much more. So my question to you would be, do we focus too much on sort of like structural part rather than the change part, or in your own sort of like reporting, as you pointed out the process and you have the checklist, do you focus more on what brings the change?
I think the most important part of my checklist actually is um, to go to an election knowing that there are many movable parts. And like I said, the first 2-3 days are just to absorb what are the movable parts in this election, and then to start watching out, looking out for them. So if you say caste is a structural factor that defines how a voter will vote, you have to see that there is a difference in the way caste operates in Madhya Pradesh from the way that caste operates, let's say, in UP or Bihar. Similarly, Hindutva. So, I mean, of these 3 elections that I went, in Karnataka, Hindutva is not able to completely counter the effect of caste. So it co-opts caste, but it also collides with caste, because caste has a much more vivid life as local network than Hindutva does. So if you go with the impression in your mind that it is going to be a caste election because caste matters, you have to be open to the ways in which Karnataka it is actually more entrenched on the ground than Hindutva. But in Madhya Pradesh, it is not. In Madhya Pradesh, I think the spatial distribution of castes is across its very well-defined regions is such that there is no one dominant caste among the OBCs, for instance, like you would find in UP or Bihar, you have the Yadavs. You do not have a pan Madhya Pradesh dominant OBC caste. So you have not had an OBC-based mobilization there. So I'm just saying, when you go to the election, you have to, apart from your checklist that is already there, you have to be prepared for learning about the movable parts, which are separate in every election.
Thank you, Vanditaji. Friends on Zoom, please do send in your questions. I've got some, so I'll use them to ask my next round of questions to Vivek, and then I'll come to friends here. So, Vivek, the 2 questions. One, I think you have largely answered this, but in case you think there's a better way of saying on things. So, one question is sort of like Hawa really arising out of public discourse, or is it something that political parties are creating and voters actually don't have an agency in being part of this Hawa? It's much more a top-down process. And second is, are there stages of making Hawa or Mahol? Right? And like, how many months or weeks before this creation of Hawa begins, and when it peaks and when it goes down?
Thank you. Is Hawa a bottom-up or a top-down phenomena? Before I do that, let me respond partly to a point that Vandita made, and I completely agree once again with that. That, to say that Hawa is the decisive factor in every election is just plain wrong. But that is not to say that in some elections it does not become the decisive factor. It does. That's one. I think, at the risk of romanticizing the Hawa too much and the Indian voter too much, that the Hawa when I started researching the Hawa, the first person who talked insightfully about it told me, and this I heard over and over again from voters, that Hawa cannot be made. Either there is a Hawa or there is not.
Okay.
But then I observed the 2014 elections, right? So I think that there are signs that have been developed in order to tell which way the public is leaning. Sometimes those signs are effectively manipulated by political parties, right? So you can say that the Hawa has been created. But at least the ideology of the Hawa is that it is a bottom-up phenomenon.
Okay.
It's a democratic phenomenon, which is bottom-up, right? That's the ideology. So I don't really have a very good answer. I think it's neither this nor that, to put it. Stages of the Hawa. I do think that there are stages, but that'll kind of take us into, it'll take too long. But the Hawa does have a clear temporal structure, in the sense that you can divide it between a period before the election campaign actually begins. So sometimes even before the campaign begins, you find people saying on the ground that is baat uski hawa hai. Many times you don't really find a clear consensus, and then when the political campaign gains momentum, right, they say that the Hawa actually builds up. Right? And then I think after the election campaign comes to an end in the last 48 hours, because talk about who to vote for actually explodes, and everyone sort of gives free advice to each other about who to vote for. Right? I would say that represents a third phase of the Hawa. And then I think, like I said, it's always clear in retrospect. So after the election results are out, and that sort of belief or that perception that existed in the pre-electoral period is borne out, like everyone will tell you, oh, is baat uski hawa thi. So that's kind of what makes the Hawa very, it's vague, like all practical concepts. Okay.
Pandita ji, what has happened in last few elections that we have started focusing on women voters much more than in the past. Earlier, we never saw sort of like differences in how men and women were voting, but now we see clear differences. So I have two questions. One is related to this women voters. Like, do you see them part of similar deliberations, or what is at work for women voters to make their decision? And second, something related to what you said in your first and opening remark, like, do you have a different way of evaluating a partisan voter, someone who says, like, I'm going to vote for party X or Y, and someone who says, I don't know who I'm going to vote for? How does the checklist for these two kinds of voters differ, or you don't care about the partisan voter and it's mostly about the floating or undecided voters?
So the first one is a question which has, troubled me a lot, the woman voter, because I think at some point in my election reporting, I looked at all the reports that I had done, and I found that I was quoting male voices, male voters, again and again and again. There would be like one maybe woman voter or two in a report, and that bothered me. And it was also that parties have started focusing on women as a constituency, but I, as a reporter, also started doing my own little bit through listening more to the woman voter. And the way that I found I had to do it, it involved more effort and more time, because typically what you do is you set out on a journey and you stop on the way and you find groups of voters to talk to, and they will inevitably mostly be male, because by the roadside or at the dhaba or even at the village chopal, you will find the men sitting. In fact, women will be toiling in the fields in the villages or inside homes in the cities. So it involves, I have the advantage of being a woman, so I have gone into bedrooms and spoken to them there. And I have then, gone, if I see a woman, it's easier for women to talk to me. So I have sought them out and then put in more effort and time in talking to them. Now, there actually a similar thing to an equivalent of Hawa comes in the way. So you start talking to women voters, and the first answer, and for some time the answer will be that I don't know much about these things, and I only do my work. I am in the house. I will go with their equivalent of Hawa. I will go with the way what my family says, or I will go with what in Bihar they will say, jo guardian bolenge. Guardian is always a male. He could be husband, could be father-in-law or father. So you have to go, again, chip past that. You have to go on I will say, yes, you will vote the way you are told, but I'm just asking you whether you're happy with the way your life is in the village. And what do you think are the issues, or what are the unresolved issues? What do you want if there's a new government? What would you want the government to do for you? And inevitably, you will find again, you will hit the reason to vote in woman voter. But again, that's one question of including the woman's voice, the voter's voice, which I make an effort now, but you have to make an extra effort because women are not as readily available and forthcoming. Now, in fact, one of the ways that I do it is I try to go to women's colleges.
Okay.
So the second question that has bothered me always is that is there a woman voter? Is there a woman voter with a set of concerns and anxieties or aspirations that are different from the male voter? I don't have an, I'm, like I said, I can't be expected to, to have a ready-made theory on this because I am not a theorist. But from my anecdotal experience, I think there is, if I look back, I see more and more a woman voter who says, for instance, I can only give you with, and illustrate this by what I saw in the elections. So in Karnataka, for instance, I found that at the end of the trip, when I looked back, I found lots of women voters said to me that we are BJP. We are voting for the BJP because we like Modi or whoever. But we do not agree with the hijab ban on the Muslim girls, students. I heard this again and again. And when I looked at my notes at the end, I found inevitably it was a woman voter who said this, that it's okay, let them wear the hijab to the classroom if they feel safe in it, or if they feel they can, it's important for them to study. And the hijab should not come in the way. So I am with the BJP, but I am not with what the BJP is doing on this. So I think that was a woman voter, if you will, from Karnataka. And in Madhya Pradesh, the election that I've just come back from, again, I think I heard many more women say this, that I get the Ladli Behna scheme, which is the 1,250 rupees per month that is given to women, or my mother gets it, or my sister gets it. But to me, it is about opportunity. To me, it is about my future, my child's future. It is that is where the government has hit a standstill. And if I'm looking at the future, I feel this government has reached a standstill and I need change. So I don't think if the Congress wins there, I mean, from what I have seen, I don't think it's a vote for the Congress as much as it is a vote for change. And the Congress is a healthy enough, in a healthy enough condition in Madhya Pradesh to be a receptacle for that vote. But I don't think it has done much to get it. Sorry, there was another question, but this was the woman question.
Yes. Do you want to still take which is about, do you have a different kind of checklist for partisan versus floating?
No, there is no check. Actually, the checklist is actually, I am making it seem more concrete than it is. It is, there are some specific questions which I go with, but then I try as much as possible to also leave things open-ended so that I can get a sense of what is important to the voter instead of the voter responding only to what I deem to be important. But about partisan voters and floating voters, of course, you can make that out. I mean, in so many places in Madhya Pradesh, it is a state with also hardened and congealed loyalties, party loyalties, where there are many voters who will only say Kamal ka phool. They will not say the candidate. They will not say Modi. They will not say Shivraj Singh Chauhan, and the others, they'll say Punjab. There will be those committed voters, but I want to talk to the committed voters as much as I talk to the others, because I want to get a sense of what motivates them to remain committed. Is there a pressure on that commitment? and in which direction? What matters to them?
Also intensity of commitment, because if the committed voter is not sort of like intensified in this campaign, then they are not
come out
mobilizing,
to vote.
and that will affect the turnout. Let me take a couple of questions from here. Melvin and Prakriti, can you help with microphones? Prakriti, here one. So let's collect 3-4 questions, and then we'll give Vivek and Pandita ji some time. Namita.
So, no, thank you so much for this. It's been very, very interesting. I had a question that's primarily for Professor Yadav, but Vandita ji may also want to respond to it. And it's kind of based on what I've seen growing up in where, and I grew up in Tamil Nadu, where there seems to be, along with this notion of a Hawa, which is also very much present there, there's also a culture of great secrecy and privacy. And I wanted to get your thoughts on how this would interact with that. Because most evocatively, there's in a lot of public spaces in Tamil Nadu, like restaurants and tea shops, there are boards that say, first, you can't have debts, you have to pay for your tea. But also it says, don't talk politics here. It is seen as a kind of crass form of recreation. And even those who do engage in these, there seem to be these informal lines that we will talk about how the vote may go. We will even talk about how the vote should go morally, but we will never tell to another person that this is how you should vote. And I thought it was interesting because if you're viewing Hawa as a kind of agency on behalf of the China, you would think that comes with at least a certain temptation to want to persuade others to vote. So just wanted to get your thoughts on how secrecy fits together.
Thank you, Mukund.
Thank you. This was a really interesting conversation. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things you said, both of you actually. So I get the idea that there is something deliberative in the process of the voter making up their minds, and there are all these other actors who are also playing a role, as Vandaji spoke about how political parties, the conceit of political parties trying to manufacture a Hawa, and your the deliberative process of the voter thinking of the public. Although I would say that for most people, unlike people who focus on elections, this is a very small part of their lives day to day. And to that extent, and their interaction with what you call the public is also very limited to certain groupings. So I just wanted to say that perhaps in the past, when there was more sort of setting of the agenda by elites in terms of voter behavior, it's a question for you, that is it the case that this idea of someone said the public, what you call the public, is it the public really, or is it the elites who are setting the thing? And what you call structural factors now, I would say identity, because whether you identify as a caste or you identify as a woman is an identity thing. So is it that this whole idea of Hawa is not so much of what the public is thinking, but what the elites who could be like people sitting in this room, but also caste elites, because India is a semi-feudal society, and for the earlier elections, when there wasn't so much discourse about elections, there is, there are different kinds of elites setting that kind of conversation. Because so that's just one question. And the second thing I have to say, because it's something I'm sort of looking into as well, how deliberation involves a process of rational thinking, but what we are seeing today in India and also in many other parts of the world, the sort of dehumanization of the other and playing on traumas to create these kind of polarized atmosphere. And we are seeing this all over the world actually. It is really appealing to an irrational part of the human mind. And, there are political psychologists like Eric Fromm, who sort of analyzed this in, after what the period before the Second World War, like what Hitler did, and so on. And many, he's followed it up with works afterwards. How much is it actually deliberation, and how much of it is actually irrational? And finally, there is so much talk about elections today that is it the case that the only deliberation is about this periodic cycle of elections, and all other modes of deliberative democracy are being completely sidelined, because somehow this process of voting is being given way more deliberative on part of the elites, including the people who are making the Hawa and on, as opposed to all other aspects of democracy.
One more question and then.
This has been a point that Indian elections have become more presidential than in the recent times when and the constitutionally our democracy is supposed to be parliamentary. So how does the phenomena of Hawa relevant to a presidential form of election compared to a parliamentary form of democracy? Like theoretically, is Hawa more correlated to a parliamentary form of democracy compared to
Vivek, would you like to start?
Sure.
May I request you to be brief in your
Yes.
response? We
Yeah.
don't have to answer all questions. Yes.
Got it. Thanks, Mukundan, for the question. I think that, the fact that de facto, the electorate is actually silent about its own leanings, own preferences, is precisely what makes visibility such a, I should say, visibility kind of two-sided in elections, so that, whatever is out and visible, whatever support is out and visible is always up for interpretation, right? How much does it actually represent that which is silent, right? So I think it's precisely because of the secret ballot that you have something like a Hawa in the first place. But, I think, one of the things that I learned while doing ethnography on was that the popularity of secret ballot among women voters, and this is something that I would actually like to know from you, because they would say that, of course, my husband tells me what to, but I don't have to kind of follow that, and that the secret ballot actually the real champions of the secret ballot I found through whatever women I could talk to are the women. That's partly to answer your question. Thanks for your comments. And I think there is a large literature and a debate in political theory about whether public opinion is simply a top-down creation by the elites through modern day kind of propaganda techniques, or is it a bottom-up process, right? And this debate has gone on since modern forms of communication have come into being. I think it is a little uncharitable and a little reductive to say that all public opinion is necessarily a top-down, right? I think one of the great things about elections is that it creates at least an opportunity or something like a bottom-up public opinion to come into being. It does not always come into being, but it does sometimes come into being. And I think this is kind of related to your third point. I think political theorists would say that, the great thing about elections is that they set into motion a process of public opinion formation, a circulation of opinions that goes on continuously, not only during election times, but also between elections. And I think you're completely right that if you look at our democracy, something is happening to modes of public opinion formation between elections, right? So that the negative power of public opinion, which surveils and kind of corrects policy decisions of the government, that there are no channels anymore. The news media is supposed to be one channel, but we know what's happened to news media. Finally, on the point about deliberation and the place of the rational elements, I think that perhaps it is a wrong expectation that has been born out of one strand of democratic theory, Habermasian democratic theory, that public deliberation or democratic deliberation is de facto rational. I think that theory is a poor theory for not just India, but for any democracy, really. Emotions play a role everywhere. So I don't think that we should actually, start with that idea that democratic deliberation should be completely rational. I mean, there is a certain rationality to emotions, true. So that's just.
Thank you, Vivek. Vanditaji. Okay.
Answered all the
Okay,
questions.
let's take another round of questions and then, Ganesh.
I just wanted to know about the role of political consultancies in creating Hawa across the state or in the constituency. And second, there are constituencies in Maharashtra and other parts where the one candidate is winning again and again for 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. So how does this Hawa works there? Thank you.
And yes, Anshuman and then Supreet.
My question is from Vandita ma'am. So, you alluded to this, but in your period of reportage, political reporting, you've seen a transformation in the information spectrum, right? Today we have a very different information spectrum in terms of social media, internet, WhatsApp, etc. So, assuming that Hawaii is an abstract phenomenon, how do you really feel, if at all, that social media as an exogenous factor affects the Hawa? In the sense that does Hawa influence the social media discourse, or is the other way around? Do we have any evidence in your sort of anecdotal even to understand?
Supreet.
Thank you. No, so if you ask two different people to evaluate or to say like what direction is the wind blowing about Hawa, I'm guessing you get, there might be disagreement about which way is the wind blowing. So I guess my question is, how does evaluations of Hawa vary by types of people? I mean, do you see, does it just vary by partisan preference? Like if I support one party, I will say the Hawa is on my side. If I support another party, I'll say the Hawa is on this side. So does it basically vary with popular support for the parties? Or do you actually see less variation in or variance in of the Hawa? Because people agree that the Hawa is actually pointed in one direction, but people's support may be different. And I mean, it's ultimately an empirical question, and I don't know if there's any work on this, but I'd be curious what your perception is.
And if I may add something from the Zoom thing for you, Vanditaji, which is like, do elections have some sort of like localized character to them, like local issues still dominate, or what we are basically told in national newspapers and what we hear on TV debates, as if only sort of like state level leadership or national level leadership and national issues matter much more. Has this changed, or do you think like local issues still continue to play a very, very important role in elections?
So the one question on political consultants. Yeah. So I have always, in my experience, from what I have seen and heard, political consultants are an outcome, their importance and their dominance on the landscape is a function of the disrepair of party organizations. So when you have party organizations where the channels of communication of the leader with the ground are broken, when you have party organizations where leaders do not trust their colleagues, they do not get information, seek information from them, when the middle rung is almost eliminated, when lower rung leaders also do not have the confidence or the ear of the central high command, those are times and moments in a party organization where the consultant becomes very important and influential. Again, from what I have seen and heard, I do not think consultants can make a Hawa. I think consultants function as a sort of a stopgap for a broken party organization. At least that's the way I have seen it happen here. I'm sure there are consultants, it's a whole professional thriving business in the West, and then they must be fulfilling other needs as well. But from what I have seen, it is this primary need of communication which has been disrupted. The normal flow of political communication has been disrupted, and the consultant comes in with teams that fan out and get asked basic questions that actually leaders and workers should be having conversations about, but don't. So that is about political consultants. About social media and whether social media makes the Hawa or the Hawa makes the social media or is reflected in the social media. Yeah, social media is definitely, and there is a new life world of the voter that you have to enter into. Also, you have to factor in the mobile phone, that he or she has the mobile phone and sees and hears and makes up and brings influence. And there is a lot of propaganda. There are all kinds of videos that go around. There's a lot of fake news that is part of that. But, again, to me, the bigger function or the factor that you have to factor in here is that I think what the Indian voter, what she or he is doing now is, it's a kind of a selfie politics. So you are constantly looking at yourself, and you're constantly also looking at yourself through the eyes of others. So that that and what Modi does is actually he picks on that and builds it. So there is India, which is constantly posing and which is posing and trying to look good to itself. And also India trying to constantly pose on the world stage and look good in the eyes of the world. So this, I think he has captured that extra element that the social media has brought into our politics. There is this need for airbrushed selfies in which we look great all the time. So I think, and that is something again that the Congress has just, I mean, among the many, many things, I think the Congress is just such a terribly inert and unimaginative organization, which, I mean, all the yatras are not going to address. It's just, I mean, my disappointment with the Congress each time I go to the ground just magnifies each time. But Modi has, I think the election, we reduce it far too often to fault lines on the ground and cleavages and Hindu-Muslim conflict, and antagonism, which is all there. But I think it is also an election of imagination. And I think in that, Modi is streets ahead. I mean, his party and him are streets ahead.
But that was saying just for national elections, not
no, so he had, okay, yeah, so the other one, the local and national. So I think the important thing that Modi's BJP does is, which it has done in Karnataka, it did fail to do, but it tried to do it there. In Madhya Pradesh, again, it has tried to do, it may or may not succeed, is to make the election less local. So that is actually a driving force, the BJP. Now again, there are, it's not a one reason issue. It's not I mean, it is about the fact that Modi wants to recast and rebuild and remold the BJP at every level in his own image. So it is that, it is the complete megalomania of a leader, which is on show. And you can see that in, I mean, the decimation of the second rung. It is visible in the sidelining of all leaders who were leaders because of their own experience and identity, and the coming in of leaders who are completely beholden to Modi and Shah. So there is that. But I think apart from that, what the BJP under Modi is also trying to do is, it is seeing, for instance, in Karnataka, for instance, in Madhya Pradesh, that there is a wear and tear of the local unit. There is a tiring of the voter with the same government, the mistakes that the government does. So it tries to use the Modi factor and the centralization to paper over the cracks in the local units. The presumption being, of course, that Modi is not subject to the wear and tear. And I mean, again, from what I have seen and heard, to some extent, they are right in doing so. There is, Modi is less showing the scars of wear and tear than the state units of the BJP, but the driving force of making the elections less local and more centralized is BJP.
Vivek, you have anything to add to the questions that were asked?
This is a good place to end. I could respond to that question.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Disagreement about the direction of the Hawa is very much kind of the bread and butter of political campaigning. I think you find two kinds of voters. People who advocate for a party, of course, until votes are cast, they do not admit that, you know, there's a Hawa for the opposing party. Everyone says, oh, there's a Hawa for their own party. Among the more neutral voter, right, the floating voter, or someone whose political loyalties are not tied to a party, I think they are probably more honest about this. But I think what's interesting about the disagreement about the direction of the Hawa is, you know, reminds us that political contest, the electoral contest, is so much a contest of appearances that people constantly try to kind of create a perception of that they're winning, of their own popularity, and that in some cases, not in all, in some cases sometimes becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the disagreement and is very much kind of the sort of stuff of electoral politics.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Vivek and Vandita ji, for such an enlightening conversation. We'll have another session on 4th of December after the results. So for last 5 years, Neelanjan and I have been doing a post-election analysis. I would invite everyone to join on 4th of December. But just to sort of like, I won't even try to summarize the conversation which we had, but something, you know, like, I think we are living in 3 different worlds of election analysis. One is what journalists like Vandita ji does so well, which is election travelogue and picking up lots of conversation. The second kind of world is where I come from, which is looking at survey data and public opinion polling. And the third one, which perhaps you draw from, which is political ethnography. What we are doing is basically living in 3 silos without a serious conversation with each other and building on each other. And I think perhaps the only way to understand Indian elections and maybe think of democratic theory from India is to have a conversation among 3 kinds of people who are trying to understand Indian voters. So thank you so much for everyone joining today, and hopefully I'll see you on 4th of December again. Thank you, Vandita ji, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.